Hello, everybody. Got a viewer request from a longtime viewer and friend um, to discuss how to raise quality chicks in confinement. Now, first, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about how I raised mine, and then I'm going to um, try to pull some information based on the information that he gave me about his methods. The video you'll notice tonight is just a slideshow of old photos of birds I've raised in the past. Thought it might be kind of a interesting change of pace for everybody. 99% of the birds in these pictures I don't have anymore, so there's that. Now let's get down into it. So, growing up back home, most of the chicks I raised were in an incubator. I did use broody hens for different times, but for most of the time it was with the incubators. And what we would do is within the first week that the chicks would hatch, they would be put in a brooder in the house with a heat lamp. Um, when I first started, we were using cardboard boxes. Then we switched to Rubbermaid totes lined with newspaper and then covered with shelf liner. And you put the chicks and their feeders and waters on top of that. Then we would keep them until they were about 2 to 3 weeks old indoors, depending on the time of year. Sometimes I started as early as February. Other years I got a lot later start. But from there they would move to one of three places. They'd either have a wire floor under them, a wood floor, or they'd be on dirt and grass. And the ones with the wood floor seemed to be the ones I had the most problems with, especially in the hot, humid summer months. And I think that's because they would, basically, the wood would harbor bacterias and pathogens from, absorbing with the moisture from the manure. And I think that's where I ran into a lot of problems with coccidiosis, to be honest, because I'd clean the pens out and I'd scrape them, but I wasn't bleaching the wood or doing any kinds of real strict sanitation on the wood. The wire, that's pretty easy maintenance. You just scrape it down clean. And the dirt, and this is why I love my mobile pens, you just keep moving them to fresh ground. Now, the ones that were on dirt, I had two different shapes of pens. One was my 4x8 triangle pen that I had designed before the ones I use now, and we would just put a tarp over it, staple it at one end, pull it clear across overnight, stick some boards on it to hold it down, and then in the morning I'd go out and pull them all back. And when the chicks were young and first put out there, I would use a heat lamp at night, and then I'd wean them off it. Or if it was still really cold out, I'd keep it on them all the time. But the other pen was an 8x8. It was 2 foot tall, and it too used a very large tarp. And the nice thing about that was we could just raise one side of it if the wind was blowing real hard. We could take the whole thing off if it was just a great day. We could keep them hunkered down and just prop it up a little bit for ventilation. But that pen was not built the best, and it was very difficult to move to fresh ground. Not to mention the fact that I had to crawl around on my hands and knees with a 2 foot tall pen to catch the chicks. And the doors on it were all on the top. So if you didn't put a door on fast enough when you crawled in there, they could potentially fly out. But for me personally, what I would do is I fed medicated chick starter, and I'd supplement that with things like insects, fresh cut greens, and if there was some extra fruit that had gone bad or something like that. So I'd feed the medicated chick starter until the feed plan, which every brand has a plan for their feeds, for their chick feeds. So when that plan would say to switch them over to developer, I would switch it to developer. It's slightly different protein content, didn't have the medication because at that stage the chicks didn't need medication. And then I'd keep them on that until the feed ration said to switch them to layer feed, at which point I'd feed them my adult feed for the entire yard. Now, once the chicks got big enough that they weren't able to be in the mobile pens anymore, then I'd start moving them to big group pens. And the biggest thing here with the group pens was that I cleaned them out whenever I would move a new group in, and I would, basically in between groups, I'd clean the pen out, let it air out for a few days if possible, and then rebed it, because air and sunlight go a long way in cleaning your pens and disinfecting them, as crazy as that sounds. Most of my waterers and stuff, in fact, I just scrub them down and use well water and put them out in the sun to dry. Once in a blue moon, I'll go around and clean everything with dish soap, but most of the time that's what I do. I just let the sun do the work. So, the big group pens, what the ultimate goal there was, is the pen had to be big enough to accommodate whatever number of birds was in it up to an adult size, so that they wouldn't have to move and they could establish a pecking order. And the only problem with that is, of course, they trampled all the vegetation, so you'd have to continually supplement them with greens, which basically I did every time we mowed. And I let the weeds grow really tall next to the pens on the outside. Not very thick, mind you, but just enough along the wire, partially to act as shade, but also to encourage insects to hang out where the chicks might be able to reach up and snag them through the wire. And I'd walk past it and shake them and put the grasshoppers into a panic, and they'd go jumping into the pen, and it did them a lot of good. I think that insect protein and animal protein is something that really benefits the young birds. I didn't feed grit because the ground where I come from had very fine gravel in it already, and I didn't start feeding oyster shell to them until they were at production age. So there's two things there also. Now, getting to these, getting to the game chickens in particular, this is why these big pens were really important for me, is I would actually make sure that I had more space than what the number of birds called for. So there was a chart that I went by, and it said that for confined space, birds in the medium weight range, which Polish and game chickens fall in that weight range, you'd want 7.5 square feet per adult bird. So I would purposely put these birds in a pen where they were only at a half to a third capacity. So if the pen could hold 30, I had 10 in there. And the reason for that is I was trying to give them as much space to exercise and run and not be crowded and stressed as possible, but at the same time keep them in a controlled environment. And I'd let them run all together in that group until the stags started turning, and then I had to separate the stags out. But I would leave the pullets together until I had made my final decisions for the brood hens from that group. Then those brood hens would be pulled, and those pullets would remain together as a group until they were sold off or moved or what have you. Now, the things that I see with the way my friend is doing it, there's a couple of things. One, he ran down his feed rations for me, sort of. Gave me a decent idea of what he's doing. And so one of the things he mentioned is he feeds chick starter in his feed. And my question is, I don't know if it's medicated or not, because he also feeds Corid to the birds until they're 5 months old. Now, Corid is the same ingredient that's in your medicated chick feed. And with those feeds, I can't remember off the top of my head how many weeks you're supposed to feed a medicated chick starter. But basically, the reason that the developer feed doesn't have that ingredient is because the bird should be strong enough to combat coccidiosis should it contract it later on. But I see where he's getting at. He's just trying to be careful. He mentioned that he uses lime in the bedding. I don't know if he's using barn lime or not, but I don't really see anything wrong with that because, after all, farmers have been using whitewash forever, and all that is a lime mixture that's painted onto the wood. It's good for the health of the animals and good for the health of the building, so that's fine. The bedding, I can't speak on cobs. He says he uses cobs sometimes, but if you're using cedar shavings, I've been told that that's not good. You want to use pine shavings, and I've always used pine shavings myself when dealing with an enclosed space. Now, these pens that he's using, they are wood floored, and that can be fine as long as you keep them dry, but I would say, if at all possible, you're going to want to you're going to want to make sure that those are cleaned and scrubbed and bleached or disinfected in some form in between your groups, so it's not creating a host for bacteria and pathogens. Also, in those pens, I don't know if he's using roost poles or not. If he said that and I missed it, I apologize. But jumping down from a roost that's at the incorrect height can mess up the joints of a bird, and of course, if the roost is too narrow, can mess up the breastbone of a young developing bird. Now, his pens are 6 foot by 4 foot, and he starts off with a very small group of quail-sized birds, and as they get bigger, he removes birds until he gets down to a single bird. He also says that these birds are turned loose from these pens every evening to free range briefly while he does chores. Now, in theory, that's a great idea. At least they're getting some yard time. But I just want to put this out there to ponder. Number one, if you have birds that are already free ranging, they've probably picked over the area all day. 2, those birds aren't going to go very far from their pens, I don't think, because they know they're going to have to go to sleep soon. And 3, every time you let those groups out, if you're letting them out at the same time, you are causing these birds to have to redevelop their pecking order every time they come in contact with one another. So those are just some things to think about. Now, the other thing I would say is, if you have a very basic rectangular pen, it could be very easy for them to get bored in there. And they could start feather pecking or get stressed out. Limited space and not much to do tends to have the stags turning on each other earlier than they normally would have. But one of the pens I really liked at my old farm, it was built off of the side of a corn crib, and the slab that the corn crib sat on sat a few feet up off the ground on the east side of the corn crib. So whenever these birds would come in and out, they would either have to fly up into the corn crib or they'd have to take a ramp. So that gave them some exercise, and not only physically but mentally as well. There's a lot of people out there who are farming like mealworms or grubs or something as a source of insect protein for their birds. And I know a well manicured farm is pride and joy of a lot of chicken people. However, as I said earlier, I used to let the weeds go really tall right next to my pens because it creates a microenvironment that will farm insects for you. And all you got to do is get them to go in the pen for you. Um, the protein level that he's feeding his birds, I feel it might be a little high. However, I don't know what the climate and the soil are like where he's from. So, it might be ideal for him. The one thing that I've been pondering a lot lately is that I see a lot of people are going with higher and higher feed percentages for their protein, and I can't help but wonder if it's because the protein in the feed is mostly vegetable protein, and so the animals are not getting the right proteins they need in the right amounts, so they're having to overcompensate. And I'll bet that if you're able to get a little bit of scrap meat or some fish or insect protein in there, that your protein content won't have to be nearly as high. You can even boil up extra eggs. If you got hens and pullets running around that you're not going to breed, boil up the eggs, grind them up, shells and all, feed them back to the chicks. It's not going to hurt them. What are some of the other things that he brought up? Overall, I mean, it sounded like he was really doing a good job of thinking through things. I just think that if anything, it would be that maybe the feed is a little too rich and there might be a little too much nurturing going on with the bird. They're actually, as I'd say to my mom, you're babying it to death. Now, obviously, his birds aren't dying. He's just saying that his birds that he pen raises aren't nearly as good as the ones he lets run. So, you got to kind of observe and think in regards to your birds that are running loose. What kind of things are going different here? Well, your birds that are loose are a lot more active. They can seek out the things that they want and need. And maybe I'm the one that's wrong on this protein thing. Maybe by running loose, they're filling up on things that have less protein, which is causing them to grow slower and have denser bones and stronger muscles as a result. And when they finally do get the feed that you give them in the evening, that just kind of tops them off to where they need to be. Whereas your pen-raised birds, they're thinking the exact opposite. They're just waiting for you to feed, and then if they're a little bit hungry, then they go looking for stuff. And that commercial feed's just going to make them grow fast. Yeah, it makes the feathers nice and pretty and everything, but growing fast and growing slow, they have their advantages one way or the other. A lot of the old meat breeds were slow growing, and it developed more muscle that way and more flavor as a result because the muscles were used more. Um, so take all of these things with a grain of salt. I'm not an expert here. I was just asked to give some tips on how I've done things in the past and to kind of analyze how this friend of mine is going about raising their birds. And I've seen photos of their brood stock and their young birds. I think they look really good. The fact of the matter is, a pen raised bird in the end is never going to be 100% equal to a free range bird. There's actually a few different show exhibitors that I know of who they free range their birds as long as they can, and basically once show season comes, that's when they finally coop them up and start working with them. And they do really well because the bird is healthy, it's in good condition, its feathers are shiny, it's developed some disease resistance by being out there in the world. So, anyhow, I hope that helps answer a few questions. Maybe it raised more questions than it answered. But if you have further questions, you can post them in the comments and I can do a follow-up video. I thank you all for watching, and if you find this channel useful, just go ahead and subscribe and share it with your friends. Thanks for watching. Bye.